Professor, you will recall what I tried to do the other day in Costanza was to talk about some of the problems of liberalism, of the liberal solution, how to deal with religion in society. My larger concern is the role of religion in our societies, and I'm concerned with both the narrow juridical issue of what we might call church and state, or the way in which you regulate religion, provide for it in constitutional and legal regimens, but also the larger question behind that, the role that religion plays in a culture and in a society. And without wishing to diminish the liberal achievement, and I really do not wish to diminish it, I mean, I am an American. I believe in liberalism and in the American experiment. But I wish to cause us to think a little more critically about some of the things we've lost with the advent of the liberal regimes and some of the problems of individualism, what that does both to the body politic and what it does to religion. And I would like to continue that reflection and to kind of take the next step of musing with you about some places where we could go. If we're in a moment in which liberalism has provided these benefits, but has also provided these problems, where can we go from here? Where can we go from here? And does liberalism inevitably lead then to a transformation of all traditional values, especially ones that use nation, blood, and faith to hold people together? Or are there ways to reclaim some of these what I'm calling pre-liberal values in our current age without sacrificing the benefits to human flourishing that are a legacy of liberalism? That's the project. And what I'd like to do in our little time together here is just talk about one possible solution, which I must say at the onset, I don't think is a solution. Is what some people offer as a solution. I don't think it is the final solution, pardon the term. But I don't mean to suggest it, but I mean to suggest that it offers some interesting ideas which I'd like to rehearse with you in this quest, in this kind of speculative quest. And I like, when I do this, I will leave more time for questions and comments. This format lends itself to a seminar type approach rather than an address. Okay. So what I'd like to discuss is a body of thought which I would call radical traditionalism as a solution. And instead of using these people, who are 20th century figures, whom I will talk about in a moment, instead of stressing blood, land, and faith as unifying factors, they include those in their discussion of what they call tradition. They use it as to mean a kind of living approbation of a sustaining wisdom of past generations, a perennial knowledge passed down from generation to generation, which provides the society with its basic identity and characteristics. Now, there are many people, especially at the beginning of the 20th century, these are the people I'm going to be talking about, who we could lump into this. We could talk about a really diverse group of them, but we could talk about people like G.K. Chesterton. We could talk about more people who took a more esoteric approach and talking about the perennialism like Aldous Huxley. We could talk about people who criticized the West for having lost something like an Oswald Spengler. They're not all alike, and they never formed a voluntary collaborative, but they share a kind of sensibility. And particularly I'd like to talk about two today, René Guénon and Julius Evola, and go over their ideas in a broad and quick way to suggest some of these themes. René Guénon is a French thinker who writes his La crise du monde moderne in 1927. And I like to think of it as an American as being 2 years after F. Scott Fitzgerald published The Great Gatsby. And you remember that novel, in product of what we call the lost generation of American writers, people like the early Hemingway, people like Thomas Wolfe. And what characterizes Fitzgerald is really this sense of the individual defining himself as an individual through what we would today we would call almost lifestyle choices. Fitzgerald is obsessed with talking about this society, this high society, which he sort of lives on the edge of. But as an Irish Catholic from Minnesota, never feels totally at home in. I mean, he lives in New York, with the Wall Street and literary crowd. He's published by Scribner's. He winds up in California writing scripts for Hollywood, but always is an outsider looking in. And really, what he's experimenting with again and again is this idea of defining himself, finding personal identity through his own choices, through his own dimension. And there's nothing really larger. Concepts of nature are brought into question. Concepts of achievement. Remember the last part of Gatsby. And Gatsby chasing the green light, moving on, but never really finding it. And there's a certain, that whole quest, even the American dream, is actually brought into question. Because these people are living in an age that had destroyed itself. The Americans are living on the edge of that. How much more are the Europeans in the middle of that? Having blown up their whole society, only to do it again a few years later. And, as Americans, we're caught up in that, but we're never at ground zero. You are at ground zero. Guénon was at ground zero. So when he writes this crisis of the modern world, it's no surprise that he should look for some kind of fundamental cause and some kind of radical solution, which I think is interesting, but ultimately questionable. But it comes in part from our whole Western awareness. I call these people, in ways, lapsarian traditionalists, to coin a rather terrible term. But lapsarian in that they're always going back to this concept of the fall, this concept of a cataclysm. Everything was perfect, and then it just fell apart. And so it's easy for them to appropriate that same kind of mentality here, that something is falling apart, the modern world is falling apart. It's based on these ideas that are wrong, and now it's falling apart. And that, of course, is something that not only Christianity, but Islam shares too, because we all share the idea of the fall, and we all share the idea of the end of the world. And so this can take a form of apocalypticism, of a kind of prophetic apocalyptic quality too. So it all gets caught up in their writing. You can hear it in their forms. So I'm going to be dipping into their works and quoting some of their language so that we can sample that. For example, it says, the belief in never-ending progress, which until recently was held as a sort of inviolable and indisputable dogma, is no longer so widespread. There are those who perceive, though in a vague and confused manner, that the civilization of the West may not always go on developing in the same direction, but may someday reach a point where it will stop, and even be plunged in its entirety into some cataclysm. I mean, has this escaped us? Don't we have these same people going around now, telling us that global warming is going to destroy the civilization, that we're going to be all flooded and choked in a short period if we don't make some kind of radical change? Well, what was the change? So Guénon, who, as you know, is someone who very much dabbles in Eastern thought. So he doesn't go to the thing that really motivates him is his own Western sensibilities, which I've outlined. Instead, he points to the Hindu concept of the Kali Yuga, the fourth age. Again, a similar idea that we've declined, that we've come from a golden age to something that we are now, this dark age that we're in. And he fears that he idealizes the East tremendously and fears that the East is being perversely influenced by the West, and that it might, thank you so much, that it might actually result in a loss of this tradition that is better preserved there than it is in the West. But he insists that there is an intuition, which is something, an intuition about what is right, which I think is valuable about these guys. This is what is valuable about their traditionalism, that everybody shares an intuition of this perennial wisdom. And that societies, that all share it. So even societies, the pre-modern Western societies and the Eastern societies, he thinks, still to a greater degree, share that. And we create these structures that cause us to forget that. And that's the problem with modernity. But just think for a moment how the concept of intuition has, I mean, he is right to point to things like Freudianism, where any kind of sense of intuition, reflection, internal reflection is what? What is it going to lead to? It's going to lead to a big pile of muck, right? You're going to look inside of you and you're going to see conflicts, you're going to see the superego struggling with the id. You're going to see, you're going to have to be led through this thing by a skilled therapist to deal with the irrational qualities that are emerging in your unconscious. The concept of the unconscious is an awful idea. It's a weapon that's used in the hands of these people to destroy what would have been this speculative tradition, this, which he's calling intuition here. Individualism, he also criticizes. Individualism, in the words of Guénon, individualism means the negation of any principle higher than the individual. Consequently, it is a reduction of civilization to purely human elements. It is the same thing as what the Renaissance called humanism. It resists and rejects, why? The epagogic quality of society. What's the epagogic quality of society? The ascending, the ladder of the epagogia is the constant ascent that is in the consciousness of the individual and of the society. Christianity today, he thinks, had become basically moralistic. It had forgotten the inner dimension, and it had reduced itself to discussion about thou shalt not do this and thou shalt not do that. And so the true doctrinal dimension of Christianity had been dulled for him. A social chaos results from this spiritual blindness. The political is only the result of the spiritual. It's this great tradition which starts in Plato, right? I love the philosophers that like to read the Republic as if it's anything other than a religious text. I went down to the parades, what? To do what? To make a sacrifice to the gods, is the first line of the Republic. And what does it end with? The myth of Ur, a myth about reincarnation in the afterlife. I mean, there's a whole new body of scholarship now trying to reclaim this idea that the Greek religion was never divorced from the Greek philosophy. The philosophers were in dialogue with that tradition very vigorously, and I think Guénon certainly is in that interpretive camp. We've created a materialistic civilization. The modern West is said to be Christian, quoting him, but this is untrue. The modern outlook is anti-Christian because it is essentially anti-religious, and it's anti-religious because, still more generally, it's anti-traditional. Since this disturbing characteristic is what makes it what it is. And so he concludes his work by saying, our chief purpose in this work has been to show how it is possible, by the application of traditional data, to find the most direct solution to the questions that are being asked nowadays, to explain the present state of mankind, and at the same time to judge everything that constitutes modern civilization in accordance with truth, instead of by the conventional rules or sentimental preferences. So, he hopes that the Catholic Church, I mean, he's a cradle Catholic for sure, will play a leading role in leading a revival. And he's writing in the 1920s. I wonder what he would think post-1965 and post-Vatican II, whether he would think that they had taken up some elements of that revival or had not. I don't know. We don't know. He didn't live that long. His Italian disciple is a man named Julius Evola. And as a little aside, in our mad American politics and the absolutely irrational, hysterical opposition to Donald Trump's, one of his very interesting advisors by the name of Stephen Bannon, once, well before he was involved in the Trump campaign, before Trump was even running for president, quoted Julius Evola in one of his speeches. And this is a guy that, you know, had a Hollywood background and Goldman Sachs background, and also Julius Evola, which is, and so right away, because as you might know, Julius Evola was involved with the fascists in Italy, and was sort of escaped their wrath, and was somewhat sympathetic to the idea, but then wound up writing a criticism, breaking with them, and writing a criticism of the fascist movement as not being traditionalist enough. But nevertheless, the media wanted to make, you know, cast this shadow. So now perhaps this shadow will be cast on us because I named the name of Evola, but hopefully not. So he is really a disciple of Guénon's. He's younger. So I'm going to look at a 1972 book of his, L'Uomini di Vatra-Dornei, Men Among the Ruins. And the title sort of says it all, doesn't it? I mean, we get a wonderful sense of this same mentality. And he talks about the organic state and contrasts it with totalitarianism, and, you know, critical sense of totalitarianism of the 20th century. The organic state is the traditional one. The state is organic when it has a center, and this center is an idea that shapes the various domains of life in an efficacious way. It is organic when it ignores the divisions and the atomizations of the particular, and when by virtue of a system of hierarchical participation, every part within its relative autonomy performs its own function and enjoys an intimate connection with the whole. In an organic state, we can speak of the whole, namely, something integral and spiritually unitary that articulates and imposes itself rather than a sum of elements within an aggregate characterized by a disorderly clash of interests. The great historic states, he thinks, were organic states. In those states, unity did not possess a merely political character, but rather a spiritual and often a religious one. The political domain was shaped and upheld by an idea that was also articulated in thought, in law, in art, customs, cult, and in the form of the economy. Organic and traditional are more or less synonymous for him. The spiritual of the whole occasioned the integration of the particular. It was not done by compression or coercion. Now, totalitarianism, on the other hand, represents the counterfeited image of the organic idea. The organic view represents something transcendent or from above as the basis of authority and command, without which there would automatically be no immaterial or substantial connections of the parts with the center. No inner order of freedoms, no immanence of a general law that guides and sustains people without coercing them, no supra-individual disposition of the particular, without which every decentralization and articulation would eventually pose a danger for the unity of the whole system. He is very critical of modern economy as being one that puts getting and possessing and above being. And is very critical of Marx, who he thinks was a chief offender in this by proclaiming that the economy is our destiny and that the economic material realm is preeminent. Very critical about what he calls the cult of work. And he's also critical about a form of philosophy which he calls historicism, which anybody would call historicism, but what he means by historicism is that it refers, he says, quoting him again, to the collapse or a disaster, a shift from a civilization of being to a civilization of becoming. Hence, everything, as Ernst Troll says, all things are historical without remainder. For him, the remainder is what it's all about. In the traditional society, civilization is characterized by stability, form, adherence to supratemporal principles, in the other to change, flux, contingency. This type of historicism, when it is not a senseless hallucination of shipwrecked people, is obviously the smokescreen behind which the forces of world subversion operate. And then the rest of the book, he launches into, remember he's writing in the 70s here, a very sharp-tongued critique of what he thinks is an active conspiracy by forces, political and economic forces, to actually create a new world order, which is interesting, and why some people are interested in it today. I don't want to go there at this point, and I don't know whether I agree with him on that, but I think to some extent he's on something, even in the 70s, which becomes relevant now when people talk about a critique of globalization and the idea that the New World Order is not necessarily serving the people it purports to. So let me conclude with my evaluation of these traditionalists, these lapsarians, as I call them. I think Guénon particularly is, he's useful as a poet is useful. He's useful as a songwriter is useful. He elicits a mood, a vision of something that could be. He's hopelessly, on the other hand, idealistic. And Evola is also similarly open to the same kind of criticism. They're also hopelessly elitist. I mean, Evola can talk about the idolatry of work because he was an Italian aristocrat. He was living off of family assets. But nevertheless, they're useful, and all of these writers, I think, are useful to always bring us back to this idea that we have lost something. Now, also, I must say in criticism, I don't think we've lost as much as they say. I don't think these past ages were quite as idyllic as these people always make them out to be. I think that's a general critique. I mean, even Charles Taylor, when he talks about this world in which everybody's bumping into ghosts all the time, I think that's a little bit exaggerated. But nevertheless, despite those shortcomings, I think there's a great deal we can learn from these reflections on traditionalism, the organic community, and the preeminence of the spiritual. So I open the floor for your reflections and reactions.
First, let me thank you for